In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. They had theorized that a human being without access to any senses or way to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive God. They'd believed the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish a contact with God by thought. An elderly man, who had claimed that he had nothing else to live for, was the only test subject to actually volunteer. To purge of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection into the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, although he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel, with no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was truly alone with his own thoughts. The scientist monitored him as he spoke about his mental state in slurred, jumbled sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his own head. Assuming it was onset of psychosis, the scientist paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him. And even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but not fully convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the walls, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic only worked for 3 days, though. He started having severe night terrors. He repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, he halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. After examination of the body, there was no apparent cause of death.